president made his just heinous remarks about Somalian immigrants at that cabinet meeting earlier this week.
Somalians ripped off that state for billions of dollars, billions, every year, billions of dollars, and they contribute nothing. The welfare is like 88%. They contribute nothing. I don't want them in our country, I'll be honest with you, okay? Somebody would say, oh, that's not politically correct. I don't care. I don't want them in our country. Their country's no good for a reason. Their country stinks, and we don't want them in our country. I could say that about other countries, too. I can say it about other countries, too. We don't want them to hell. We have to rebuild our country. You know, our country's at a tipping point. We could go bad. We're at a tipping point. I don't know if people mind me saying that, but I'm saying it. We could go one way or the other, and we're going to go the wrong way if we keep taking in garbage into our country. Ilhan Omar is garbage. She's garbage. Her friends are garbage. These aren't people that work. These aren't people that say, let's go, come on, let's make this place great. These are people that do nothing but complain. They complain. And from where they came from, they got nothing. You know, they came from paradise, and they said, this isn't paradise. But when they come from hell, and they complain, and do nothing but bitch, we don't want them in our country. Let them go back to where they came from and fix it.
And it was one of those moments where, you know, I know we're all exhausted from outrage, right? And there's this collective, you feel it in sort of the legacy press corps. Look, I could tell you you're like, oh God, really? Here he goes again. And my immediate reaction was, public's not going to care. They're going to shrug their shoulders. But then I sat there and said, no, I think the public does care. They just don't know how to express it anymore, right? We don't quite know how to, right? You know, the inability to shame people in the Trump era has taken away, I think, the public's best tool to keep politicians from totally misbehaving. And that's a big part of this. But is this who we are? Is this who you want to be? Calling reporters piggy, particularly the harsh words he uses for any woman that pushes back on him. What he says about anybody who's not white, who's an immigrant in this country. The dehumanizing and demeaning way. I mean, using the word garbage. I mean, this is what inspires hate attacks on members of various immigrant communities, is when you have somebody with the platform that Donald Trump has referring to people in this dehumanizing way. I don't believe a majority of Americans want or accept behavior that the president showed this week. Now, we've had these conversations before. He has, you know, demeaned people with disabilities. He has mocked, you know, where does it end, right? He mocked John McCain for being a prisoner of war during Vietnam. He's called soldiers suckers and losers, those that died in battle and in combat, because as he essentially is making clear, he wouldn't have allowed himself to be stuck having to fight in the military and be drafted. Pick whichever foot you want to pick to find out whether he can, whether he was eligible or not for the draft, or whether his deferment was honest. But he wasn't alone on that, and so that's why it hasn't been a penalty. But this is why I used the phrase Trump fatigue, and that I think Trump fatigue is a much bigger accelerant to what I think is going to be a tough election and a tough political environment for Republicans in 26. That there's just an exhaustion from Trump's antics. And the more, and in some ways, right, we're on reruns, but we're on like crappy reruns. You're like, I don't want to watch this show again. I don't want to see another version of this again. You know, I'll confess, it makes me even angrier at sort of how poor Biden led this country. I'm sorry. I do. I hope a better leader would have helped the country move on from Donald Trump, but we didn't have that, and we are where we are. But there are moments like this week where you're like, I can't believe we went back to this. Because I don't think individually anybody that a large majority, and perhaps, this has been a question that I've had uncomfortable conversations with people I trust. Perhaps some of you out there have had similar that, you know, I've used the phrase others, we're not this way. This is not who we are. What if it is, right? What if we're in the minority? What if what if there is such a belief, I've had conversations with people who I think are high character people who shrug their shoulders at Trump's behavior. And they shrug their shoulders for a variety of reasons. One is they believe, hey, politics is a tough business. You kind of need an asshole in there. I think a lot of you know voters like that, right? Who are so cynical about how politics works, so cynical about Washington, and I understand it. But what I try to remind people is that the cynicism that is driving the Trump movement about Washington is a perception that while there are nuggets of reality, for the most part, this isn't what it is. But eventually, perception does become reality, because we have seen in the Trump era, Donald Trump has mainstreamed a kleptocracy, right? The idea that Washington is for sale is not controversial. It's just how you do business. Every Fortune 500 company in America knows that if they want favorable treatment from government regulators, there's an easy way to do this. You don't have to go to Congress. You don't have to go to the agency. You go to Donald Trump and you simply say, what can you do about this? And by the way, we'd love to become a contributor to pick whatever slush fund he's got going on. Maybe it's a public sector slush fund like the East Wing building or his inaugural fund, or maybe it's his library or whatever it is. And, I don't say this to just throw it out there. This is a fact. I'm just telling you, this is currently how the influence game in Washington is working. It is so efficient right now because there's no complicating factor. Everybody knows if you write a big enough check and you get in front of him, you can get whatever you want, right? Look at the pardon situation. I mean, he just pardoned this pardon of the former president of Honduras, who was a massive cocaine trafficker. I mean, this is one of those where, and if you've noticed, nobody is defending this publicly, and quite a few Republicans are expressing discomfort with this one and are going ahead when caught by reporters with sticking the microphone in their face, aren't willing to just ignore this one, aren't willing to just say, well, Trump's Trump, are actually going, this certainly sends a mixed message given supposedly the focus of what we're up to with Maduro and in Venezuela. But the fact of the matter is, the former president of Honduras had figured out the game. So he hires Roger Stone, pays him, and Roger Stone gets in front of the president, and he probably calls in a favor or two. Who knows how much the price was, right? We don't have any transparency on that. We have transparency on the pardon itself. We have transparency on the request for the pardon from the former president himself, but we don't know how much he paid essentially an influencer, which Roger Stone essentially is I don't even know if he would have to register to lobby. I might argue, did he violate? I'm curious if this is, since he's representing a foreigner in this pardon request, whether he filled out the proper paperwork, which many a lobbyist has failed to do, which actually is a crime if you didn't register as a foreign agent, whether somebody would have to register as a foreign agent in order to represent that. Given, I think that at a minimum, given that Roger Stone, back in the days of Black Manafort and Stone, since they kind of invented, or it certainly they didn't invent the influence game, but they certainly expanded the reach of the influence game when they first came to prominence in the 80s during the Reagan era. He knows the rules, so my guess is if on this front he likely followed them, filled out the correct paperwork, because he doesn't care if he's fingered as a foreign lobbyist. He's not running for office, or he's not going to be up for any Senate-confirmed position. This episode of the Chuck ToddCast is brought to you by Wild Grain. Wild Grain is the first bake from frozen subscription box for artisanal breads, seasonal pastries, and fresh pastas. Plus, all items conveniently bake in 25 minutes or less. Unlike many store-bought options, Wild Grain uses simple ingredients you can pronounce and a slow fermentation process that can be easier on your belly and richer in nutrients and antioxidants. Wild Grain's boxes are fully customizable. They're constantly adding seasonal and limited time products for you to enjoy. In addition to their classic box, they now feature a gluten-free box and a plant-based box. I checked out the gluten-free box, and let me tell you, they have a gluten-free sourdough bread. We got 2 loaves of it, and we've done 1 loaf already. It's a cranberry and almond sourdough bread. It's like the best raisin bread you've ever had, except it's not raisins. It's hit or miss if you mess around in the gluten-free bread world. This is a hit. This is well done. It's not heavy. It doesn't feel like a rock. Anyway, seriously, I was impressed. So look, for a limited time, Wild Grain is offering our listeners $30 off your first box, plus free croissants in every box when you go to wildgrain.com/Toddcast to start your subscription. $30 off your first box when you go to wildgrain.com/Toddcast. That's wildgrain.com/Toddcast, or simply use the promo code Toddcast at checkout. Always use the code, get the discount. I'm telling you, it's excellent, excellent bread. But the point is that we all know how this works. And it is that sort of craven on that front. And, at what point, and I do think that there is this is where I believe the exhaustion comes in that when you talk to people individually, many of whom may be Trump supporters, and you ask them if this is something that they would want to support in a politician, they'd all say no. And then when you ask them why do they tolerate it in Trump, they will come back to this perception that somehow, well, politics is a dirty business and you kind of need a dirty representative sometimes in order to accomplish this. The problem is this is exactly what Donald Trump wants people to think. And he's trying, and this to me is the explanation of how did Henry Cuellar, a Democratic member of Congress from South Texas, end up getting a pardon from Donald Trump. There are certain crimes that the Justice Department prosecutes that Donald Trump doesn't think should be criminal. Whether it's, being influenced. He essentially pardons anybody who commits a crime that he is committing. So I guess you could say is at least he's being generous with that, right? Henry Cuellar took money to be influenced. Well, Donald Trump is taking money all over the place and being influenced to sign pardons, to agree to grease the wheels on regulation, to look the other way on a merger and acquisition. Look at the game they're playing with with Warner Brothers right now. I'm following this pretty closely. This is a former employer with Comcast trying to get their hands on Warner Brothers, Netflix. Then, of course, there's, what's the future of CNN, since that's part of the Warner Brothers organization. Is the Ellison family going to become essentially the new Murdochs, right? And they're going to consolidate and try to control as much of the news ecosystem as they can with CNN and CBS. In any normal administration, there's no way any of these mergers could happen. Netflix wouldn't get regulatory approval. Comcast wouldn't get regulatory approval. Neither would Warner Brothers. Already we're seeing that the administration is raising eyebrows about Netflix, raising eyebrows about Comcast because of the president not liking Brian Robertson, still mad over all things NBC, MSNBC. Trust me on this one. His obsession over Comcast is all about his failure as host of The Apprentice. Okay, that's what this is about. His leftover anger at NBC is that. Trust me, I've heard it a million times from him. He believed that show was much more successful than it actually was because he used to say things, The Apprentice pays your salary, and it's like, I don't think so, brother. But you keep telling yourself that. So there's this weird sort of, he's so angry at NBC that he's just going to punish Comcast, right? It's really less about NBC News and MSNBC. It really is all about The Apprentice. It's also his anger with Jeff Zucker. All right, it's weirdly, it all comes back to it. You got to remember, ultimately, if he's got a grievance, it's usually something personal. And in this case, it's about The Apprentice, because obviously The Apprentice has become part of his identity. But when you're watching this, um, the government's playing favorites. They're basically saying, look, there won't be any regulatory, shouting basically at Warner Brothers shareholders and the board of directors. Listen, if you take the Ellison deal, it won't be a problem at all. You decide you want to green light an acquisition by Netflix or Comcast. Well, there's going to be a lot of regulatory interest in looking at this deal. This may take a year, maybe it takes 2 years. How long? Maybe the value suddenly goes down, and this doesn't happen, and etc. Now, you know, we'll see if the private sector can conduct business based on the private sector without government interference. But it seems that Donald Trump um, wants to decide who gets to own Warner Brothers and CNN. And so here we are. This is what's really striking to me, is how normal this is all being portrayed. That this is just Trump's Washington. This is how it works. The pardon of Henry Cuellar, nobody's even blinking at this point about him once again likely selling a pardon. I mean, let's see what was the price for Henry Cuellar. Is it a party switch? Right? Do we see that in the next? Is it a promise to party switch if they need that vote to control the House of Representatives? Who knows, right? But let's just say suddenly Donald Trump has leverage over Henry Cuellar. Now, I question. Obviously, Cuellar was vulnerable to a deal like this, and this is what Trump does. This is just like the mafia, right? It is, it's akin. I used to tell a version of this story. So a criminal organization comes into a shopping district and says, "Hey, good news! We've got some. We're going to be able to provide security for you now." And you, as the shopkeep, say, "Well, I didn't ask for any new security." "Oh, so you don't want any security for your shop?" "Well, anyway, if you do want security, this is what it's going to cost." And then the next morning, the shopkeeper comes back and he sees that his store has been ransacked. And then the criminal element comes back to the shopkeep the next day and he says, "So, you said you didn't need security. Do you think you need security now?" That's how a criminal syndicate creates leverage over somebody who might want to be honest. And suddenly they're between a rock and a hard place. You're Henry Cuellar, whether maybe you believe you're innocent, maybe you did commit a crime, but you certainly have this hanging over your head. Here comes Donald Trump. He doesn't do these things for zero. So I think we're all just wondering what is it that Henry Cuellar has either agreed to, or perhaps Donald Trump hasn't called in his favor yet. But the point is that this is now everyday business. And this is kind of the point. It goes back to, why are we so numb when the President of the United States attacks fellow human beings and calls them garbage? Why are we so numb when one of the largest cocaine traffickers in the history of this country is set free due to a presidential pardon? Why are we so numb when a foreign country hands a nearly $1 billion plane personal gift to the president and in return gets a NATO-like security agreement for a country that has not necessarily worked in America's best interest when it comes to Afghanistan or Israel or other parts of the Middle East? We're just shrugging our shoulders. And I look at the pardon situation. So again, to sort of circle it back to why I do think, while the individual items here don't cause the political feeding frenzy and don't create this sort of moment of pressure, and I'll get to why I think that isn't happening for a variety of reasons. I do think now that with this crummy economy, sort of exhaustion from 10 years of this, that this stuff doesn't play well the way he thinks it plays well. And so you have a base of his party that's sort of tired of the same old antics and exhausted from having to somehow rationalize their support for him when he couldn't be a more low-life character morally or ethically, right? If any other politician behaved this way, particularly if they had a D next to their name, all of these Republicans that are looking the other way on Donald Trump would be filing articles of impeachment. The only upside out of this pardon business is that I do think we're going to reform. There's no, if there's, I think in the next 10 years, there's going to be a constitutional amendment that puts some guardrails around presidential pardons, perhaps creates a pardon board where the president is not the final say, but is part of a group that has a final say. But what is happening now is just totally delegitimizing the Justice Department as a whole. I mean, this guy, and what was funny is the U.S. attorney in charge of the Sovereign District of New York, the Southern District of New York, right? Perhaps the most important district within the Justice Department, arguably its own mini Justice Department. That's who prosecuted um, this former Honduran president. And oh, by the way, the prosecution actually happened during the first Trump administration. He was finally extradited to the United States, and the sentencing took place during the Biden era. So this there's not even this way makes this even more of a head scratcher, right? This was an investigation and a prosecution that, in theory, started and took place during Trump's first term, was completed during Biden's term, and now Trump obviously has decided, he will decide who gets punished and he will decide who gets set free. Um, this is the stuff that I think is the extra anchor that is going to drag Republicans down because it works two ways. It demoralizes sort of Trump supporters that are like, my kids keep asking me, why I vote for him. How do I defend, him attacking fellow human beings and calling them garbage and all of this corruption with the pardons. And oh, by the way, the economy sucks, right? That's why I think this is real weight this time, and that this isn't something that's going to go away. But there is another reason why this stuff isn't sticking in the immediate, and that is the fragmentation of the U.S. media. I mean, take the current situation at the Pentagon. Um, so Hegseth successfully, essentially, got rid of the professional journalists from covering the Pentagon because they, forced some, frankly, something that was against the First Amendment. I don't think was constitutional in what they did. I got to think there's going to be I think having to sign that is unconstitutional, and I gotta think there's going to be a lawsuit that has some success on this. I'm not active in the First Amendment legal community because I'm not a lawyer, but if I were, that certainly would be something I'd be advocating and would be working on. But so now it's a whole bunch of influencers, right? You got Laura Loomer, you got that sort of wannabe white supremacist, right? This a poor man's Tucker Carlson, what's his name, Jack Probasiak or whatever, sort of a truly sort of irrational clown. Um, and they're all kind of sycophanty, but it says, Hegseth hasn't had to face a barrage of questions, right? We even have this new Inspector General report out that says exactly what everybody said he did during Signalgate, which is he risked the lives of folks involved in that mission. Um, yes, he technically had the power to declassify those things, and but apparently he could not come up with the paperwork or prove that he had done anything to declassify it other than, I guess, magically thinking about it in his head. It's kind of like the Donald Trump defense during that investigation of the classified documents that he had. He said, "I just thought about declassifying it, so therefore they're declassified." Um, but to but you look at the fact that there's no sort of media pressure on Hegseth the way we would have had 20 years ago, right? Where you had, I don't know if any of you remember Bobby Ray Inman, who was a nominee for defense secretary during Clinton, had some things in his background. It became kind of a feeding frenzy, and he ended up uh, pulling the nomination. We don't have these moments because we have such a fragmented media. I think if a if we had the less splintered media, and you had more of and everybody were focused on what's going on with pardons, it would create, I think, national urgency. It would force attention, and there, I think then you would have more members of Congress, regardless of party, ex- being forced to go on the record on how they feel about these things. But we don't have that right now because this is another thing. In some ways, Trump has accelerated this, but his attacks on the mainstream press to delegitimize the mainstream press, and he's done a terrific job of doing this. Um, with the help of a legacy entity like Fox News, who sort of character assassinated many a journalist in their day. Um, by doing all of this fragmenting, it makes it so no one thing becomes the focal point for the sort of entire political press corps. I would argue these pardons are among the most criminal things we've had a president do. In fact, I'm gonna one of my ToddCast time machine is going stories as soon as the anniversaries come up is going to be about um, the story of Lamar Alexander having to be sworn in early as governor of Tennessee because the person he was replacing was literally selling pardons as he was out the door. And it was such that Democrats joined Republicans and essentially getting rid of the guy. It happened in the 70s. I will have the more of the details, but the basic story was the Tennessee legislature, which was Democratic controlled, essentially they 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 accelerated the timeline to swear in Lamar Alexander to stop the outgoing governor from selling pardons. Um, it's actually how Fred Thompson got his acting career because they did a movie about this loosely, and the movie maker couldn't find anybody to play Fred Thompson, who was the lawyer at the time, for Lamar Alexander during this period. So Fred Thompson played himself, and lo and behold, it started a career. But the point was, there was a time when selling pardons, like Donald Trump is doing, was something that outraged left and right. That it was just, this isn't what you do in a free country. This isn't what you do in a democracy. And if you do it, it's criminal. And it should be stopped. And I think the lack of focus, the fragmented media, right? There isn't just one, and he does plenty of things that cue the outrage, right? The attack on Somali immigrants, what he does to Ilhan Omar all the time, how he personally goes after people that in some ways there's distractions, right? Venezuela story is a big story, so maybe the pardon, takes a back seat. And it's not new, right? Donald Trump selling a pardon is no longer a shock anymore. And look, Joe Biden didn't help the pardon story when he did his versions of preemptive pardons and gave all these pardons to his family members. It's to me one of the just worst things he could have done because he essentially provided cover and a permission slip for Donald Trump to abuse the process even further. And look, I'm no fan of whataboutism, but when you can give your opponent material that allows them to say, what about, then you're not in the best place on that front. But I do think we totally are we're under angered by this pardon situation, and I don't think we fully appreciate the long term impact this is going to have on our ability to convince another country to combat corruption, our ability to convince another country to extradite bad actors that we want to prosecute because our rule of law is so ironclad and so well respected. He is totally damaged the perception of America as an honest place for the rule of law. And that can have a long tail effect that makes businesses less comfortable doing business in this country, right? One of the reasons why we're supposed to be a safe haven to start a business or bring money into here is the strength of our rule of law. But if it is now this manipulable, and that's the thing, like, are the people that follow Donald Trump, if we are not outraged by the selling of pardons in this administration, are we going to be outraged when the next president decides to do it? So our inability collectively to enforce some sort of guardrail on this, to see to sort of, I mean, it has become so normal for him to do this that it's being treated like another plane landing safely at National Airport. And I'm just here to tell you that, to repeat an old Bob Dolism, where's the outrage? There should be real outrage here. I've spent a lot of time on pardons on my podcast, but hey, I know I'm part of the fragmentation now. Um, but this is an extraordinarily important story. And if you're somebody with some influence listening to this, I don't think there's any overselling the importance of what we're seeing take place in the slow destruction of what the United States of America is supposed to represent when it comes to the rule of law, when it comes to freedom, when it comes to honesty. Um, what he is eroding, you don't just automatically get it back when he walks out the door. And certainly, if JD Vance is his successor or somebody, they're going to see what he got away with. And we know this. Every president sees what a previous president gets away with and tries it a little bit more themselves. We've yet to see a president voluntarily give up power, voluntarily like give, hand power back to. We've heard rhetoric claiming they would, but they're never signing legislation that would. Um, so it's going to probably take a constitutional amendment. Um, but what we're seeing with with the use of the pardons, this is dictatorial. This is the one dictatorial power he actually has. And he is, I don't think anybody realizes how much damage this is going to do to us long term, to the rule of law, to pay to play in this town. It is the next stop on the road to losing this republic is going to a full-on kleptocracy. Right now, it's the Trump's Republican Party that's the kleptocracy, where everything's pay to play. But this will get contagious and may already have gotten contagious very, very quickly.